I am Major General Dr. Anya Callahan, 47 years old. I command the sentinels that guard our nation from orbit. Yet in the opulent air of my family's Napa estate, my greatest accomplishment was simply being invisible. My mother, Eleanor, greeted me not with a hug, but with a judgment sharp as chilled glass. "Success is the dress code tonight, Anya." My sister, Lottie, then sealed the verdict, pressing a flimsy paper name tag into my hand. My titles scrubbed clean as if they had never existed. They had placed me in the party's Siberia, a wobbly table exiled to the clatter and steam of the service kitchen. The brittle paper felt like a final sentence in my palm as I fixed the practiced smile to my face, a mask of placid endurance honed over a lifetime. It was a familiar performance, standing in a room full of people who saw only the quiet failure my family wanted them to see. Have you ever been the most accomplished person in a room, yet made to feel the smallest by the very people who should have lifted you higher? The air in the barrel room was thick with the scent of aging oak and ripe Cabernet grapes, a fragrance of wealth that clung to everything but me. Crystal chandeliers, like frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto the polished concrete floors. Through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the California sunset bled purple and orange across the rolling hills of the vineyards, a breathtaking vista that felt more like the wall of a beautiful prison. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in a simple, dark blue silk dress that felt like camouflage. The sound of polite laughter and the clinking of wine glasses formed a wall of noise I couldn't seem to penetrate. I found my assigned spot just as they'd intended. It wasn't just in a corner, it was a tactical placement of social exile. The small bare table stood beside the swinging doors to the service corridor, and with every pass of a waiter, I was hit with a gust of clattering plates and the greasy smell of fried appetizers, a jarring contrast to the delicate aromas of the wine. From my outpost, I had an unobstructed, humiliatingly clear view of the head table. There, the place cards were not paper, but exquisite blocks of reclaimed oak, names like Senator Blake Vanderbilt and CEO Jameson Price, laser-etched into the wood. They laughed, leaning into each other's orbits of power. A constellation from which I had been cast out. A whisper, sharp and clear, cut through the din from a neighboring table. "Is that Lottie's sister? She looks so ordinary." The woman who said it wore a diamond necklace that could have funded a small satellite launch. The word ordinary didn't sting. It landed with a dull thud, a cold, heavy confirmation of my invisibility. A shadow fell over me then, blocking my view. I looked up into the handsome, self-satisfied face of Blake Vanderbilt, my ex-boyfriend from Stanford, now a slick Beltway senator with perfectly tailored ambition. He held a glass of what looked like a Macallan 25, swirling the amber liquid as if it held the secrets to the universe. He didn't ask how I was. He delivered a pronouncement. Anya, still staring at the stars from some windowless lab. "Such a shame," he said, his voice smooth with condescension. "Stanford lost a real talent when you walked away." His words were a scalpel, expertly reopening the old wound my family had kept festering for 2 decades. They loved this narrative. Anya, the brilliant disappointment, who chose dusty books and obscure theories over a dazzling, lucrative future. I offered him the faint smile, the one that cost me nothing and gave away even less. "The stars have been good to me, Blake," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turbulence inside. The final crucifixion came when Lottie took the stage, radiant under the spotlight. She spoke of her journey, her ambitions, and then, after announcing her new appointment at the Department of Homeland Security, her eyes found mine across the room. Her gaze was a spotlight of its own. "And I want to thank my sister Anya," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous, saccharine sweetness that the crowd mistook for affection, "for always having the courage to follow her own unique path, no matter where it didn't lead." A few polite chuckles rippled through the audience. It was masterful. In one sentence, she hadn't just insulted me, she had weaponized my entire life. My service, my sacrifices, my career, all of it was reduced to a cautionary tale of eccentricity, a public failure to be pitied. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, feeling the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on me. I was stripped bare and nailed to a cross of their condescending sympathy. And as I stood there, utterly alone, I realized this wasn't the first time they had tried to erase me. The first time it was with a can of soda and the wreckage of my dreams in our garage. It all began at the science fair. The sterile clink of a wine glass against a plate somewhere behind me faded away, replaced by a memory so vivid it carried its own sound and smell. I was no longer in the Napa winery. I was 17 again, back in the two-car garage of our home in Palo Alto. A space that smelled of pine resin, hot solder, and the metallic tang of ambition. That whole summer, I had lived in that garage. It was my sanctuary, my laboratory, my universe. While other kids were at the mall or the beach, I was building a radio telescope from scratch. A wildly ambitious project for the state science fair, pieced together with salvaged electronics and parts my father, a quiet engineer, helped me source from surplus stores. My father, Richard, understood. He didn't talk much, but he understood the language of circuits and diagrams. He saw the fire in my eyes and quietly fanned the flames. Lottie, my sister, saw it too, but she only saw it as a threat. In our house, there was only supposed to be one star, and its name was Lottie. My project was an unwelcome constellation in her sky. My telescope wasn't just wires and a satellite dish. It was a listening post to the cosmos. It was a world away from the complicated, unspoken tensions of my family. A place where the signals from deep space were infinitely clearer than the emotional static in my own home. I'll never forget the first time it worked. It was 2 a.m, the neighborhood silent, and through the crackle of static, a faint, rhythmic pulse emerged. It was a whisper from the Andromeda Galaxy, 2.5 million light-years away. A sound that had traveled through the vast, cold darkness for eons, finally ending in my headphones. I felt a surge of pride so pure it was almost painful. For the first time, I had created something that was truly undeniably mine. The day before the fair, Lottie threw a tantrum. Our mother had refused to let her go to an NSYNC concert on a school night. The house echoed with her dramatic sobs and slammed doors. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my final calibrations. I was kneeling on the concrete floor, checking a connection, when she stormed into the garage. "Oops," she said. The word was a tiny, sharp icicle. I looked up just in time to see her trip over a power cord, a can of Coke arcing through the air in a perfect, deliberate trajectory. It landed with a sickening splash right on the central processing board of my telescope. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Anya," she wailed, tears instantly welling in her eyes. But through the facade of her performance, I saw it. A flicker of triumphant, venomous glee. It was not an accident. It was a strategic strike. An act of sabotage designed to pull me down from my stars and back to the messy, competitive earth where she always won. The sickly sweet smell of burnt sugar and the sharp hiss of short-circuiting electronics became the soundtrack to my heartbreak. It's a smell that has haunted my dreams for 30 years. I ran inside, the ruined board in my trembling hands, tears streaming down my face. "She did it on purpose," I cried out to my mother, who was comforting a sobbing Lottie on the living room sofa. Eleanor didn't even look at the board. Her eyes, cold and dismissive, were fixed on me. "Don't be ridiculous, Anya," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "It was an accident. Your sister tripped. You always make such a drama out of everything. Instead of blaming Lottie, maybe you should have been more careful. Don't leave your messy projects all over the house." Her words slammed a door in my soul. It wasn't just that she didn't believe me, it was that she didn't want to. My passion was an inconvenience. My success was a disruption to the family's carefully balanced ecosystem, which revolved entirely around Lottie. My achievements were messy. Lottie's tears were real. That night, I sat alone in the cold, dark garage, trying to repair something far more broken than a circuit board. My father found me there hours later. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside me for a long moment, then quietly placed a worn paperback copy of Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot on the workbench. He put a hand on my shoulder, a brief, heavy pressure, and then left. That single, silent gesture was both a profound apology and a sad confession. It said, "I see you, I know your pain, and I am powerless to stop it." He understood my hurt, but he wouldn't or couldn't confront my mother to defend me. I realized then, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I was completely on my own. My father's love was like the distant stars I studied. It existed, I knew it was there, but it was too far away to ever truly warm me. From that day forward, I stopped expecting anyone to fight for me. As I held that book, the silent testament to my father's love and his powerlessness, I asked the darkness a question for the first time. If I couldn't find justice here, where else could I go to build a world of my own? The question I'd asked the darkness in my parents' garage echoed for years. Where else could I go? The answer, I decided, was anywhere but there. After completing my doctorate at Stanford, I made the call. I told my mother I would no longer be accepting the family's financial support. The silence on the other end of the line was colder than any disapproval she had ever voiced. It was the sound of me being completely cut off, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. I moved to a cramped studio apartment in Mountain View, a place with thin walls and rent that devoured most of my paycheck from a junior position at a small private research lab. The work was beneath my qualifications, but it was honest, it was mine. For a while, I felt a quiet pride in my independence. Then the dot-com bubble burst. The year was 2001, and Silicon Valley's glittering promises evaporated overnight. The lab went bankrupt, and suddenly I was a PhD in astrophysics with no job and dwindling savings. My new life became a grueling rhythm of survival. By day, I was a barista at a Peet's Coffee, the smell of burnt espresso clinging to my clothes. I'd spend 8 hours on my feet, forcing smiles for tech bros who ordered complicated lattes, completely unaware that the woman serving them could calculate the orbital decay of a satellite. By night, I was a math tutor, driving my beat-up Honda Civic across the Bay Area to help high schoolers with their calculus homework. I remember those long drives home, exhausted to the bone, my stomach aching with hunger, watching the sprawling lighted mansions of Palo Alto in the distance. In those moments, a cold sliver of doubt would pierce through my resolve. Was this a mistake? Did I throw it all away for nothing? It was during those commutes, desperate for something to fill the lonely silence, that I discovered podcasts. One evening, stuck in traffic, on the 101, a voice came through my car's crackling speakers. It was Brené Brown. She was talking about vulnerability. I'd spent my entire life believing vulnerability was a liability, a weakness to be hidden at all costs. But then she said a sentence that changed everything. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. The words hit me with the force of a physical impact. My silent endurance, my quiet suffering. I had always seen them as proof of my failure to be tough enough. But Brown was reframing it. My willingness to stand alone, to be unseen, to risk failure on my own terms. That wasn't weakness. That was a different kind of strength. I started devouring her work, listening to her talks on shame and courage. I began to see my journey not as a string of defeats, but as a trial by fire. I was being forged, not broken. One night, I was closing up the coffee shop. It was late, well past 11, and I was wiping down the last of the tables. A man, older and dressed in a simple, unassuming way, had been sitting in a corner for the last hour, nursing a single cup of black coffee. As I went to tell him we were closing, I noticed he was looking at the textbook I kept under the counter, an advanced text on astrophysics I'd read between customers. He didn't ask about my job or my family. He just pointed at the book. "That's heavy reading for a coffee shop," he said, his voice calm and observant. We started talking. He was a retired Air Force colonel. I told him about my studies, about my passion for the unseen signals that hold the universe together. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity I hadn't experienced since my father was alive. He told me about a new branch of the service that was being formed, a place that wasn't about dogfights and glory, but about silent strategic defense from above, a place that needed minds like mine, a place where quiet service was the highest honor. For the first time in my adult life, someone saw my value, not what I had walked away from. He saw what I was, not what my family thought I should have been. A few days later, I drove to the United States Air Force recruiting office in San Jose. I parked my Civic and stood on the sidewalk, my heart pounding against my ribs. This was it, a leap into the absolute unknown. A complete renunciation of the path everyone, my mother, Lottie, even Blake, had expected of me. Their voices echoed in my mind, a chorus of mockery and disappointment. Then another voice cut through the noise. It was Brené Brown's, quoting Teddy Roosevelt in The Man in the Arena. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, who at the best knows, in the end, the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was done being a spectator in my own life, cowering from their judgment. I was tired of running, with a resolve that felt as solid and real as the pavement beneath my feet. I walked to the glass door and pushed it open. I was stepping into the arena. The world I entered was a world away from Napa's performative luxury and Palo Alto's quiet cruelties. My new home was the Aegis Squadron's command center at Vandenberg Space Force Base, a secure, windowless facility that felt like the heart of a living machine. There were no crystal chandeliers here, only the cool blue-white glow of immense data screens that covered every wall. They displayed the elegant, silent dance of satellite trajectories, color-coded threat assessments, and streams of classified data that flowed like digital rivers. The only sound was the steady, low hum of server banks and the quiet, focused clicks of keyboards, the collective heartbeat of our nation's vigilance. This wasn't a place for show, it was a place for purpose. My second in command, Colonel Eva Rostova, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a mind that moved faster than most supercomputers, greeted me each morning not with judgment, but with a crisp, concise briefing. "Ma'am, situation stable. All birds are green. We flagged a minor anomaly on the C5 satellite's telemetry, but it resolved itself. Likely just a sensor ghost," she'd say, handing me a data slate. Here, my title, Major General, wasn't a weapon for others to mock or a shield for me to hide behind. It was a responsibility, a burden I was proud to carry. Respect wasn't given based on your family name or the zip code you grew up in. It was earned minute by minute through competence, through sleepless nights spent staring at data, and through the shared, unspoken weight of protecting the country from threats no one would ever know existed. The warmth I never found in my family's mansion, I found in the stark, utilitarian break room down the hall. There was no Chardonnay or artisanal cheese. There was just a perpetually stained, overworked coffee machine that produced a brew thick and black as engine oil, served in heavy ceramic mugs stamped with the Air Force logo. After a particularly tense 12-hour shift monitoring a potential solar flare that threatened to knock out GPS systems, my core team and I gathered there, utterly exhausted but relieved. A young lieutenant, a brilliant kid from Ohio, named Miller with a mind for quantum physics, pushed a slightly crushed cardboard box towards me. "We saved you one, ma'am," he said with a genuine, tired smile. "The one with the sprinkles, it's the best kind." Inside was a single, slightly misshapen donut from the Dunkin' near the base. It was a simple, cheap pastry, likely stale. But in that moment, it felt more valuable than all the catered delicacies at my family's glittering parties. It was a gesture of inclusion, of simple, honest camaraderie. It said, "You are one of us." We didn't talk about our pasts or our family dramas. We talked about the upcoming Army-Navy football game, complained about the terrible coffee, and debated whether the new Star Trek series lived up to the old ones. We were a team, a family forged not by blood, but by shared purpose, mutual trust, and far too much caffeine. The deepest form of recognition, the one that finally healed a wound I didn't even know was still open, came not in a public ceremony, but in the quiet of my commanding officer's office. General Mikhailov, a gruff old-school soldier who seemed to be carved from granite, called me in for a periodic review. He was a man of few words, and praise was not one of them. He didn't ask me to sit. He simply pointed to a single blinking red dot on a global threat map from the previous month, a dot that had since turned a calm, steady green. "Good work on that, Anya," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The history books will never know you prevented a catastrophe that night. The politicians on the Hill will never know, but I know, and that's what matters." His words, delivered without ceremony or flourish, landed with more weight than any award or public accolade ever could. It was the validation I had craved my entire life, not for being brilliant, not for being successful in their terms, but for doing the work, for being reliable, for being seen. It was recognition from someone who truly understood the profound cost of that responsibility. That sense of belonging was cemented one night at Theater 300 hours. The piercing shriek of the red alert alarm, a real-world non-drill threat, ripped through the barracks' silence. I was in the command center in under 3 minutes, but my team was already there, their faces illuminated by the urgent crimson glow of the screens. Eva was already coordinating with NORAD, her voice calm and authoritative. Miller was running threat assessments, his fingers flying across the keyboard. No panic, no hesitation. Just a calm, focused ballet of expertise. I stood in the center of the room, the pit, and watched them. I wasn't their boss. I was the conductor of an incredible orchestra. I saw Ava's determined jaw, Miller's focused eyes, the steady hands of the young airmen and guardians around me, all of them a silent wall protecting a sleeping nation. In their quiet competence and unwavering dedication, I saw the reflection of my own deepest values, and a profound, unshakable truth settled in my heart. This was my family, not of blood, but of the oath. For months, my life at Vandenberg had been a sanctuary of logic and order. The quiet hum of the command center was my symphony, the trust of my team my fortress. I had built a world where merit was the only currency that mattered. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the outside world breached the walls. It wasn't a klaxon or a red alert, but something far more insidious. A phone call from my sister, a ghost from a life I thought I had successfully quarantined. Lottie's voice, when it came through my secure line, was like honey laced with something I couldn't quite place. "Anya, darling, I have the most wonderful news," she began, her tone effervescent, bubbling with a practiced warmth. "Mother and I are working with Vanity Fair on a feature. Women in Government, a Family Legacy. It's a multi-generational piece about service. And of course, they are dying to include you. I told them all about my brilliant, trailblazing sister. I just think it's high time the world knew how proud our family is of you." Every carefully chosen word was a small, perfectly polished stone, laid to build a bridge I knew was unsafe. My internal threat assessment system, honed by years of analyzing data for anomalies, began flashing silent red warnings. This wasn't about pride. This was about optics. Lottie, ever the political strategist, was shoring up her public image for a future confirmation hearing or campaign. A feel-good family story, complete with a heroic, high-ranking military sister, was an invaluable asset. A prop to be polished and displayed. A part of me, a small, foolish, 17-year-old part I thought I'd buried long ago, wanted to believe her. It was a faint, treacherous flicker of hope for a reconciliation that had never come. But the rest of me, the 47-year-old general who had survived my childhood, knew better. I agreed to meet, not out of hope, but out of a cold, strategic necessity, to understand the full scope of her maneuver. I needed to see the battlefield before I engaged. We met at a classic DC steakhouse, the Prime Rib, the kind of place with dark wood paneling, deep leather booths, and air thick with the murmur of political deals being made. It was Lottie's home turf. She was radiant in a tailored dress, a master of the room, while my mother, Eleanor, sat beside her in a formidable St. John power suit, a picture of matriarchal authority. "Darling, it's so good to see you," Eleanor said, squeezing my hand as I sat down. Her grip was firm, a gesture of control, but her eyes were already scanning the room, landing on a senator holding court in a nearby booth. "I'm so sorry about everything. The past is the past. We're family, after all. That's what matters." The apology was as hollow as a chocolate Easter bunny, a line delivered for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. For the next hour, they painted a beautiful picture of their proposed Vanity Fair spread. They talked about photographers, maybe Annie Leibovitz herself, Lottie mused, and locations about what I should wear. Something in uniform, of course, but soft, approachable, Lottie suggested, as if I were a brand she was launching. "We want to show the woman behind the uniform." They never once asked me a single question about my actual work. not about the pressure of command, the sleepless nights, the life and death decisions that were my daily reality. I felt less like a person and more like an accessory they were choosing, a high-value piece of military hardware to be added to their collection of political assets. I ate my filet mignon, which tasted like ash, and listened, gathering intelligence. Then Lottie played her next card, the one I had been waiting for, rewriting history. "You know, I was just thinking about when we were younger," she said, her voice filled with a manufactured nostalgia as she delicately cut a piece of her salmon. "You always said you just wanted to be left alone with your books and your projects, remember? You didn't want a big fuss made. I always tried so hard to respect that, to give you your space. It was hard because I just wanted to shout from the rooftops how brilliant my big sister was." Eleanor nodded enthusiastically, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "Oh, that's right. She was always so worried about you, Anya, so protective. She knew you were sensitive." It was a masterful act of gaslighting, executed with the precision of a surgical strike. They were taking their years of neglect, their deliberate, painful exclusion of me, and recasting it as an act of loving respect for my wishes. My silence, born of pain and resignation, was being twisted into consent. My isolation was now my own choice. A cold, quiet anger began to build in my chest, a low-frequency hum beneath my practiced calm. I was watching them construct a false narrative in real time, and I was the central character, a willing recluse they had so generously accommodated. I stayed silent, letting them think their strategy was working, watching the chess pieces move, waiting for the checkmate. It came as we were leaving. In the opulent, hushed lobby, away from the prying ears of the dining room, Lottie pulled me into a hug. It felt like being embraced by a beautiful, cold statue. "I'm so glad you agreed to this," she whispered, her warm breath a chill against my ear. Her voice dropped then, losing all of its public, saccharine sweetness and taking on a hard, sharp edge of steel. "It would be a terrible shame if your difficult past came out, wouldn't it? All that time after Stanford, before you found your footing. The odd jobs, the financial struggles. People wouldn't understand. In this town, it could look so unstable." She pulled back, her eyes wide and sincere, a perfect mask of sisterly concern. "It's better that we tell our own story, the right story." And there it was, the mission objective, clear and undeniable. It wasn't an invitation, it was a threat, delivered with a smile and a hug. A piece of blackmail wrapped in the language of family loyalty. She was holding my past hostage, threatening to weaponize the very struggles I had overcome on my own to destroy the career I had built without them. I walked out into the cool DC night, the valet holding my car door open. The perfectly cooked steak was a bitter, indigestible knot in my stomach. Her words echoed in my head, over and over. Better that we tell our own story. The fortress I had so carefully built around my life, the world of logic and honor at Vandenberg, suddenly felt vulnerable. The battle wasn't just in the stars anymore. It was here, on the ground, and the enemy was my own family. Lottie's whispered threat lingered in the air of my office for days. A toxic, invisible gas. Better that we tell our own story. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. My calm, orderly world at Vandenberg suddenly felt fragile. My meticulously built career, standing on a foundation she was threatening to dynamite. For 20 years, my strategy had been silence. I had endured, I had outmaneuvered, and I had built a life so far removed from their world that I thought I was safe. I was wrong. Silence was no longer a viable defense. It was time to gather intelligence. My first call was to Blake Vanderbilt. He picked up on the first ring, his voice stripped of its usual senatorial smoothness. It was frayed with guilt. "Anya, I had to call," he stammered. "After I saw you at that dinner, what Lottie said, it didn't sit right with me." "What didn't sit right, Blake?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. He took a deep breath, and the confession tumbled out, a cascade of shame and regret. He told me about a meeting years ago, shortly after I'd left Stanford. Lottie had convened a small, influential group of alumni, including him. With tears in her eyes, she had told them a tragic story about her brilliant sister suffering a quiet mental breakdown, overwhelmed by pressure. She claimed I was obsessed with privacy, paranoid even, and had begged her to help me disappear from the public eye for my own good. She asked them, as friends, to help her protect me by quietly using their influence to remove my name from academic honors, alumni awards, and historical records at the university. "She made it sound like an act of mercy," Blake said, his voice cracking. "She said you were too fragile for the spotlight. We thought we were helping you, Anya. I am so sorry." The phone felt slick in my hand. So it wasn't just neglect. It was a coordinated, strategic campaign of erasure. A quiet, systematic dismantling of my legacy before it had even begun. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine, but I kept my voice level. "Thank you for telling me, Blake." I was about to hang up, but he stopped me. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping lower. "There's more, and this is the part that's kept me up at night." I sat down heavily in my office chair, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. 2 years ago, he began, his voice barely a whisper. "When your father was in the hospital, in his final days, Lottie called me hysterical. She said she couldn't get a hold of you, that you were on a top-secret, deep-cover mission and were completely off-grid. She said she had tried every channel." The world around me began to tilt. I remembered that week with agonizing clarity. I had been at Vandenberg, overseeing a critical satellite deployment, but I was not off-grid. Not for a family emergency. I had waited by the phone, my heart in my throat, for a call that never came. A call from Lottie to tell me it was time. "I never got a call, Blake," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. "I know," he choked out. "I found out later from a cousin. Lottie never called you, Anya. She never even tried. She told everyone you were too busy serving your country to come say goodbye." A sound escaped my throat, a raw, strangled gasp. He was gone. My father, the one person who had seen me, who had silently handed me a book by Carl Sagan as a balm for my broken heart, was gone. And she had stolen my chance to hold his hand one last time, to tell him I loved him. She had used my uniform, my service, the very life I had built to escape her, as the weapon to sever me from my own father's deathbed. It was a betrayal so profound, so monstrous, that it defied comprehension. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot nova exploding in my chest. I hung up the phone without another word. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. There was one more call to make, a confirmation I needed, a final piece of the puzzle. I called a trusted friend at the Pentagon, a 4-star general I'd served with for years. I asked him to check on an old rumor, something I dismissed as gossip at the time. He called me back in 10 minutes. His voice was grim. "It's true, Anya. 5 years ago, you were the top nominee for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It went all the way to the final selection committee." "What happened?" I whispered. "The nomination was withdrawn," he said, and I could hear the anger in his voice. "The committee received a letter. It was from your sister, as your next of kin. It said that, due to your intensely private nature and your philosophical aversion to public accolades, you had humbly requested that your name be withdrawn from consideration. She wrote that your greatest reward was the service itself, not the recognition." That was it, the final blow. She hadn't just sabotaged a science fair project. She hadn't just erased my name from a few university plaques. She had reached into the highest echelons of power and stolen the nation's highest civilian honor from me. Using my own perceived virtues as her justification, she had built a cage for me out of my own integrity. I ended the call and stood up. The shaking stopped. The white-hot pain receded, replaced by something cold, dense, and absolute. The grief, the rage, the accumulated betrayals of 30 years coalesced into a single point of crystalline clarity. A line my father used to quote from his worn copy of the Bible echoed in my mind, a whisper from the grave. "For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, nor is anything secret that will not be known." My time for silence was over. My period of endurance had ended. I picked up my phone and dialed my second in command. Colonel Rostova answered immediately. "Eva," I said. My voice was no longer my own. It was a different instrument now, low, calm, and forged in ice. "Prep a CV-22 Osprey. I need to get to Napa, now." Back at the Napa winery, Lottie was at the apex of her triumph. Bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight, she was accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Alumni Association, a prize she had undoubtedly lobbied for herself. She spoke eloquently about the burdens of public service, the sacrifices made when one chooses to live under the harsh glare of the spotlight. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. From the edge of the manicured lawn, shrouded in the shadows beneath an ancient oak tree, I watched her performance. I wore a simple charcoal gray dress, the color of twilight, and I stood perfectly still. I was no longer the wounded girl from Chapter 1. The pain had been burned away, leaving behind a terrifying calm, a focus as sharp and cold as deep space. I was simply waiting for my cue. The serene atmosphere of the valley, the gentle clinking of wine glasses, the murmur of polite conversation, the distant strains of a string quartet, was about to be shattered. It started as a low, deep thrumming, a sound that didn't belong in the tranquil Napa sky. It was a rhythmic, powerful roar that grew steadily, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't the sound of a commercial jet or a private plane. This was the sound of raw, rotational power. The string quartet faltered, their bows hovering over their strings. Conversations died mid-sentence. The fairy lights strung between the oak trees flickered as the air pressure changed. Every head turned, every eye scanning the darkening sky. Then it emerged from the twilight, a monstrous angular silhouette against the last vestiges of the sunset. A CV-22 Osprey. It didn't circle, it descended, its massive twin rotors tilting forward as it hovered 50 feet above the immaculate lawn. The sound was deafening now, a righteous thunder that drowned out every other noise. The downdraft hit the party like a physical blow. A hurricane of wind tore across the terrace, sending linen tablecloths whipping into the air, flipping over chairs and shattering dozens of wine glasses against the flagstones. The guests cried out, shielding their faces, their expensive dresses and tailored suits rippling in the manufactured gale. A powerful searchlight from the aircraft's belly snapped on, sweeping across the crowd, bleaching the color from their panicked faces, transforming their smug satisfaction into stark terror. The Osprey's side hatch hissed open. Framed in the doorway against the operational lights within, a figure appeared. Colonel Eva Rostova, immaculate in her dark blue Space Force dress uniform, descended the ramp with a steady, unhurried gait. Her boots made no sound on the soft grass. She ignored the chaos, the gaping mouths, the terrified guests. Her eyes, sharp as lasers, were locked on a single target, me. She marched in a dead straight line across the lawn, her path parting the stunned crowd like the Red Sea. She stopped precisely 2 feet in front of me, her posture ramrod straight. In the roaring chaos of the rotor wash, she executed a salute. It was a textbook movement, sharp, powerful, and utterly unwavering. An absolute, deafening silence fell over the party. The roar of the Osprey engines, the only sound left in the world. Every single person was frozen, their attention riveted to this impossible, unbelievable scene. Then, Colonel Rostova's voice cut through the thunder, clear and authoritative, amplified by the strange acoustics of the moment. "Major General Callahan," she declared, her voice ringing with indisputable power. "Ma'am, I have a message from Space Command. There is a critical, time-sensitive threat to Project Chimera. Your immediate presence is required." The 2 words, Major General, detonated in the center of the party, like a bomb. Blake Vanderbilt stood paralyzed, his glass of scotch slipping from his numb fingers to shatter on the stones below. Lottie's mouth hung open, her perfectly crafted smile of triumph frozen into a mask of abject disbelief. And my mother took a staggering step backward, her hand flying to her throat as if she had just seen a ghost. The woman they had dismissed, the woman they had so carefully and systematically erased, was not the family failure. She was a high-ranking commander, a guardian of national security, and her world had just come to reclaim her. They had wanted a show. I had given them one, but I knew this was only the opening act. The war for the truth would be fought on a different battlefield tomorrow. The flight back to Vandenberg was a blur of tactical analysis and suppressed fury. The supposed threat to Project Chimera had been a ghost, a cleverly fabricated digital trail designed by my own team to justify my extraction. It was a necessary deception, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth. My arrival back at the command center was met not with relief, but with the opening salvo of a new, far more insidious war. We were already in the middle of a real crisis. A sophisticated cyber attack, likely from a rival state actor, was probing the defenses of Chimera, our next-generation satellite defense network. For hours, I was immersed in that world of pure, cold logic, my team and I working in seamless concert to parse malicious code and reinforce our firewalls. It was a high-stakes, invisible battle, and we were winning. That was my world, a world of facts and precision. Then General Mikhailov summoned me to his office. He didn't speak. He just pointed a thick finger at the large monitor on his wall. It was split into 4 screens, each displaying a live feed of social media chaos. Twitter, TikTok, cable news tickers. They were all ablaze with my face. Lottie, it turned out, had not retreated after her public humiliation. She had counterattacked with breathtaking speed and venom. There she was in a series of professionally shot videos, her face a mask of sorrowful concern. With tears glistening in her eyes, she told a fabricated story to the nation. She spoke of her deep love for her sister, but also of her growing concern over my erratic behavior and mental fragility under the immense pressures of command. My dramatic arrival in Napa, she explained, wasn't an emergency extraction. It was a desperate staged cry for attention. A shocking abuse of military assets for a moment of personal vanity. She had even coined a hashtag, a brilliant, poisonous little barb that was already trending. General Showboat. The narrative was simple, emotionally resonant, and utterly false. It painted me as an unstable, arrogant officer wasting taxpayer money to show off at a party. Disinformation networks, likely amplified by the same foreign adversaries we were fighting in cyberspace, were pushing the story into every corner of the internet. My 20 years of silent, dedicated service were being erased in a matter of hours, replaced by a caricature of a petulant, power-tripping diva. My calculated silence, once my shield, was now being interpreted as guilt-ridden arrogance. "I know this is garbage, Anya," Mikhailov said, his voice a low growl. He stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the launch pads in the distance. "The Pentagon, however, is getting nervous. The press is eating this up. The optics are a disaster." He turned to face me, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Worse, this whole circus is creating the perfect smokescreen for the real attack on Chimera. Our enemies are exploiting the chaos Lottie created. The noise she's making is giving them cover." The weight of his words settled on me. This was no longer a personal family drama. My sister's ambition and cruelty had metastasized into a legitimate threat to national security. The battle for my reputation and the battle for our nation's defense had become one and the same. "The Joint Chiefs are demanding a response," he continued. "The official inquiry begins tomorrow. They want you to issue a public statement, to fight back. But I know you, Anya. That's not your way." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But your silence is no longer an option. This is an information war now. You have to fight it." I returned to my sparse quarters, the general's words echoing in my head. "You have to fight it. But how?" To engage in a public mud wrestling match with my own sister felt like a desecration of everything I stood for. To trade accusations and sound bites felt like a surrender to her world, a world I had fought so hard to escape. The pressure felt immense, a physical weight on my chest. In a moment of desperation, I reached for the one thing that had always centered me. On my nightstand was the worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the same one my father had given me all those years ago in the garage. The pages were soft, the spine cracked. I opened it to a passage he had underlined in pencil, a passage I had read 1,000 times. "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." The ancient words settled my racing heart. I would not become like her. I would not fight with her weapons of deceit and emotional manipulation. I would not sling mud. I would respond, but I would do it on my own terms. I would use the one weapon she could never understand, the unadorned, unassailable truth. My resolve hardened, the chaos in my mind slowing to a cold, clear focus. Just then, my personal cell phone, the one I rarely used, began to ring. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in years, Blake Vanderbilt. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Anya," he said, his voice urgent, stripped of all its political polish. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I need you to listen. Lottie is not just creating a media storm. She's setting a trap." "What kind of trap, Blake?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "She's hosting a Future Leaders Summit for alumni at the Academy, a huge media event. She's positioning herself as the keynote speaker, the voice of reason and integrity. She's going to use that stage to publicly call for your resignation, framing it as a painful but necessary act to protect the dignity of the armed forces." He paused, taking a breath. She thinks you'll stay silent, that you won't show up. She's building a stage for a public execution, Anya, and you're the guest of honor. I listened, a cold clarity washing over me. A stage, a public execution. Lottie had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. She had just given me my battlefield. "Thank you, Blake," I said, and for the first time I meant it. I knew exactly what I had to do. Lottie's Future Leaders Summit was being held in the Academy's main auditorium, a grand hall with soaring ceilings and seats filled with alumni, donors, and a significant press corps. It was a media circus she had orchestrated for a single purpose: to publicly execute my career. Naturally, I wasn't on the guest list, but I came anyway. I wore my Class A dress uniform, the dark blue fabric perfectly pressed, my medals gleaming under the stage lights. Not as trophies, but as quiet testaments to years of service. I walked through the side entrance and stood at the back of the auditorium. A ripple of whispers spread through the room like a contagion. Cell phone cameras turned from the stage to me. Lottie, who was in the middle of a passionate speech about transparency and integrity, faltered. I saw her eyes widen for a split second, a flicker of pure panic before her political mask snapped back into place. She finished her speech to polite applause and was about to move on to the Q&A portion, the part where she would no doubt receive a planted question about the Jugs General showboat controversy. But I didn't give her the chance. I began walking down the central aisle, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent hall. I didn't run, I didn't shout. I simply walked, calm and deliberate, towards the stage. When I reached the front, I turned to the Academy's president, an old general sitting in the front row. I didn't ask for permission, I didn't request the floor. I informed him, "Sir, I would like to address the summit." He looked from my face to Lottie's, his eyes missing nothing. He stood up, a sign of respect that silenced any potential objection, and nodded to a technician. "Give the general a microphone." A young man nervously handed one to me. I walked up the steps onto the stage and stood a few feet from my sister. There was no anger in my eyes, no thirst for revenge. There was only a cold, hard clarity. This was not about her. This was about the truth. "Service," I began, my voice clear and steady, filling every corner of the vast hall without a hint of a tremor, "is not always about being seen. In fact, true service is often a profoundly quiet act. It's a promise kept in the dead of night when no one is watching." I didn't look at Lottie. I addressed the audience, the cameras, the history of the room itself. I told them about my team. I told them about the Aegis Squadron. I told them about Operation Polestar, a Christmas Eve when my team detected and neutralized a cascading cyber attack aimed at the national power grid, a silent war fought and won while families across the country slept peacefully, unaware of the darkness we had held at bay. I told them about Operation Guardian, when a young lieutenant named Miller noticed a fractional anomaly in a GPS satellite signal, an error that, if left unchecked, would have sent hundreds of commercial flights off course. I spoke of the men and women who miss birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays, not for glory, but for the silent, steadfast watch. "They don't ask for parades," I said, my voice resonating with a quiet power. "They don't get hashtags. Their names are not etched onto alumni awards. Their reward is the knowledge that the world is a little bit safer because of what they do in the quiet and in the dark. I am privileged to command them. I am honored to serve with them. That is my story. That is my truth." I paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Then, for the first time, I turned and looked directly at Lottie. Her face was pale, her composure cracking. "Silence," I said, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity, "is not an absence of contribution. You can erase a name from a plaque. You can lobby to have an honor withdrawn. But you cannot erase an action from the flow of history. You cannot erase service." A profound, respectful silence enveloped the auditorium. Then the Academy's president walked onto the stage. He took the microphone from the stand. "This Academy," he announced, his voice booming with authority, "has made a grievous error in allowing its legacy to be manipulated. We have failed one of our own. That ends today." He turned to me. "General Callahan, your legacy belongs here, in these halls, as a testament to the highest ideals of service. We will rectify our mistake." As he spoke, a murmur went through the press corps. Phones lit up. On the massive screens flanking the stage, which had been showing Lottie's professional headshot, a new image appeared. It was a breaking news alert from the Associated Press, its headline stark and undeniable. "White House President to award Presidential Medal of Freedom to Major General Anya Callahan for decades of quiet, heroic service." A collective gasp went through the hall. The cameras swung from me to Lottie. She stood there, exposed under the harsh lights, the architecture of her lies collapsing around her in real time. Her face crumpled, not in tears of remorse, but in the agony of public defeat. She had built a stage for my execution, and instead she had witnessed her own. The aftermath of the summit was not a celebration, but a quiet, profound silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage of my family's public image, and for me, a strange, hollow peace. A few weeks later, a text message appeared on my phone. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. "Can we meet?" Lottie. We met at a small, windswept cafe in Carmel by the Sea, a place far from the power corridors of D.C. and the strategic silence of Vandenberg. We sat at a small table overlooking the turbulent gray expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The woman across from me was not the polished, formidable politician I had faced down on stage. The designer clothes hung on a frame that seemed to have shrunk. Her eyes were shadowed with an exhaustion that makeup couldn't hide. She looked broken. She confessed everything, her voice a low, halting whisper against the sound of the crashing waves. She spoke of a lifetime spent in my shadow, of an all-consuming insecurity that had festered into a poisonous jealousy. She felt like a flawed echo next to my quiet brilliance, a constant runner-up in a race she had invented. "I never wanted you to disappear," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. I didn't know how to shine while you were standing next to me. Your light was so bright, it felt like it burned." I listened, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or pain. I felt a vast, weary pity. I saw not a monster, but a deeply broken person who had tried to shatter me to feel whole. Forgiveness felt too simple, a cheap word for a wound so deep. So I didn't offer it. Instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over hers. Her hand was cold. "Then perhaps," I said softly, my voice carrying the calm of the ocean before us, "it's time we both stopped running the race." It was an armistice, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain, and a mutual decision to finally walk away from the battlefield. The medal ceremony at the White House was a stately, formal affair. Dressed in my uniform, I stood in the Oval Office, a room steeped in the weight of history. As the President of the United States placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around my neck, the blue ribbon cool against my skin, I saw my mother sitting in the back row. She was dressed quietly, without her usual armor of designer labels. For the first time in my life, she was looking at me, really looking at me, with an expression that held both awe and a deep, painful regret. A decade ago, that look would have been my entire world. Now it was just a distant signal from a star that no longer governed my orbit. The pride I felt, deep and steady, didn't come from the heavy gold medal or the president's handshake, or even my mother's belated recognition. It came from within. It was a quiet, solid core of self-acceptance I had forged in the fire of my own journey. I no longer needed their applause to know my worth. In the weeks that followed, offers came flooding in. A high-level policy position at the Pentagon, a lucrative consulting gig with a defense contractor, a seat on the board of a major aerospace company. They were the prizes my family would have wanted for me. I turned them all down. I chose a different path. I accepted a position to head a new mentorship program at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. My new battlefield was a classroom, my new mission to shape the next generation of leaders for the Space Force. I stood before them, a room full of bright, ambitious young cadets, and I didn't teach them about orbital mechanics or tactical strategy. I taught them about the quiet courage of integrity. I taught them that the most important battles are often fought in silence, and that true leadership is defined not by the accolades you receive, but by the values you refuse to compromise. My legacy, I realized, would not be the wars I won, but the guardians I helped to forge. Months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I found myself back at my old prep school in Palo Alto. I walked alone through the familiar halls to the Heritage Hall, a long corridor lined with plaques honoring distinguished alumni. At the far end, in the most prominent position, was a new bronze plaque. It was simple, elegant, and permanent. It read, Major General Anya Callahan, Ph.D. And beneath my name, there wasn't a list of accomplishments or awards. There were only 2 words, the official motto of the Space Force, the creed that had defined my true north, Semper Supra, always above. I stood there for a long time looking at the name that had once been written on a flimsy paper tag. The woman who had been made to feel like a ghost in her own story had become a permanent part of its history. My legacy wasn't in the bronze, it was in the quiet, steady knowledge that I had risen above the gravity of my past to find my own place among the stars. My journey to that bronze plaque wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation, about finding my own Semper Supra, my always above. Now I want to turn the microphone to you. What silent battles have you fought to reclaim your own narrative? What moment defined your strength when no one else was watching? Your story of resilience deserves to be honored. Please share a piece of it in the comments below. If stories of rising above resonate with you, follow the Chosen Revenge channel, where we believe every quiet victory is worth celebrating. Thank you for listening.